would appeal to the slaves. We would say that they use that as some kind of escape, and I think it goes back to your ideas about the tragic. And
right. Well, Hegel, basically makes the case that the Christianity is opposed to the tragic worldview because it seeks a resolution. The slave might be a slave and might be suffering from unequal relations in life, but upon death, he goes up to heaven and achieves this state of equality with everyone else, and doesn't have to worry about it anymore, that Jesus and God take care of you in the end anyway. And this eliminates the tragic worldview because it does provide a resolution. It just provides a resolution in death. And Hegel basically says, that's not what we experience. I mean, no one experiences death in heaven enough to make that a legitimate ideology. So, in other words, in order to fulfill itself, Christianity has to get away from this emphasis on the afterlife and instead try to manifest a real kingdom of heaven here on earth, which would be a total state in which everyone would be taken care of and everyone would be equal, and we would find a balance between the way we're pulled in various directions by loyalties and everything else in our lives. And that's what Hegel ultimately saw Christianity heading to, was this total state. And is there going to be another kind of total state that's unequal? Are there going to be smaller states that war against each other and recapitulate pagan relationships and the pagan tragic worldview? I mean, one of the questions I keep having is Thelemites fight with each other all the time. And if there was, Thelemic slave states and little Thelemic masters and feudal roles to play, wouldn't there be these conflicts breaking out constantly? And wouldn't the Thelemic masters have to prove themselves by willing to risk death to advance their projects, etc.? Wouldn't that necessitate a return to the sort of pagan worldview? This idea I've been playing with, and I don't know how you could avoid that from a certain perspective.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. We're throwing out a lot of ideas for people to think about and kind of mull over themselves and see what their own emotional...
One of the concerns I would challenge your listeners who are pagans, is to look at the pagan tragic worldview and wonder why neo-paganism isn't interested in it, for the most part. Why neo-pagans have continued to have a sort of happy-ending Christian worldview to everything, and why they haven't rediscovered the tragic worldview. Alain de Benoit brings this up in his book on being a pagan. And I think it's something that they could stand to look at. If they're not Thelemites, if they're pagans, they need to ask themselves, are they really pagans? Are they interested in a pagan tragic worldview? Or are they really more Christians than they are pagans?
Well, I think Thelemites should ask themselves the same question.
I would agree.
So, all right, well, thanks again for being on the show. 93.
Thanks for having me, John.
Thanks again to Keith418 for being on the show. Lastly, David Jones is a longtime Enochian practitioner and has written a number of articles that can be found on the internet, especially on Hermetic.com. Here's David talking about Enochian magic, and in particular, the Enochian tables. We have on the phone with us David R. Jones. Are you there, David?
I am here.
Welcome to the podcast, 93.
93. Do it through the hall of law.
Love is the law, love under will. There's a lot of writing about Enochian on the internet, and there's a lot of references to the Enochian work that you have done. So I've wanted to have you on the show to talk a little about that. At one time, you published some articles in the Second Lodge newsletter, and those are on the website. And I started reading some of those, and it was very interesting on how you kind of broke down the Enochian system into three parts: zodiacal, planetary, elemental, and then you started systematically going through those. So I wanted to ask you some questions about that. Mm-hmm. First, how did you kind of come up with that, the three-part system, seeing them as zodiacal, and what do you associate with the zodiacal and the planetary and elemental and so forth?
The principle of attacking any magical system that way first came to me from Ebony Onto, and he had this idea called the three realms of magic. And as I started exploring grimoire magic, and particularly Agrippa, who's one of the first persons to systematize Renaissance magic in any sort of clarified way, I saw that pretty much all systems of grimoire magic are based on this division. And so I looked at the Enochian system because I knew that D was adept at using Agrippa's system. He was familiar with it. He frequently notes it in the marginalia to his stuff. He talks about it in some depth. And I associated the two things and found out that indeed that the Enochian system fit into this model because there were sets of 12, sets of 7, and sets of 4 and 5. And when you see sets of 12, sets of 7, sets of 4 and 5, it's usually a dead giveaway that they are astrological, planetary, and elemental in those orders. And there are other little things that clues that you have along the way. If they start talking about planets, which D does, or they use the archangels that are traditionally associated with governments of ours, you can be pretty sure they're planetary. When you see tribes of Israel, especially ones that are associated with the directions, then you can be pretty sure that there's some underlying zodiacal system. The Sefer Yetzirah talks about this to some degree, and a lot of the Renaissance magic is based from the Sefer Yetzirah into Kabbalistic magic. It's intrinsic in Kabbalistic magic in general. So that's originally how I attacked the problem. Once you've divided them up that way, then what they do is a little bit more ambiguous, but elemental issues tend to relate to physical reality around you. Planetary are a little more esoteric. They tend to imply forces that are active in your universe and that move around, which are differentiated, say, from the building in which you live. Love, war, hatred, one's will, even wealth on a sort of generic sense are all sort of forces, things that come through one's life and are more related to planetary forces. Zodiacal forces are more background information on some level, but they also relate to larger, more cosmic phenomenon, but also to who we are as human beings. So that on some level they're personal. But they also, both zodiacal and planetary issues relate to timing issues too. You find that in the ethers in particular, you find that there are zodiacal attributions that you can derive from the governors. And they have a lot to do with timing issues for how the ethers work more efficiently than at other times. Jim Eshelman actually wrote a fairly detailed series on how the vision of the voice relates to zodiacal issues in, I think it's called The Black Pearl, I think it's his publication. And if you look at my system, you can sort of track it. The idea is that each governor has an angel who rules over it. Each angel is ascribed to a tribe. Each tribe is thereafter ascribed to a zodiacal sign. And so that at any given time of the day, there are 4 astrological signs above the horizon. And I argue, if you look at the Enochian system and look at the ethers, that the implication there is that you would desirably call those ethers when those signs are above the horizon. And if you look at when Crowley has trouble getting into the ethers, as Eshelman points out, and which I've verified to some degree, the more trouble he has is when he's not cognizant. I don't think he's ever cognizant of that, but I think he accidentally gets it right most of the time. And it's not that hard a trick to get right, because they're fairly long periods of time. So on a given day, a good quarter of the day, those 3 signs are going to be above the horizon. If that makes any sense. Right,
and you figure that out by governance of the hours, and you set up...
Well, the governance of hours is a different issue. Governance of hours is a planetary issue. I mean, you have to learn the basics of astrology and know what's above the horizon at any given moment. It's constantly in flux. That's what the rising sign is based on. The rising sign is, or the horoscope is based on what is directly due east at a given moment, and then half of the sky is going to be above the horizon. Half of these zodiacal signs, between 6 and 8, are going to be above the horizon, either in toto or in part, because you could have half a sign on one horizon, half a sign at the other horizon. I guess 7's all you can probably have at any given moment, and that's moving. And each sign takes 2 hours to transit above the horizon, so they're above any given sign's above the horizon 12 hours during the day.
So you suggest that, let's say, you're going to work a particular ether, you should find out when it's above the horizon, and in general, anywhere above the horizon is fine.
Right. When the 3 governors who rule that ether are above the horizon.
Okay.
It's more problematic with the two ethers where there are four above the horizon. And they are problematic in various kinds of ways, Tex and Perron and Lin. And so there's a sequential issue there. There's a quadrature going on there, and I think that one has to sort of, you can get all four of them above the horizon, but it's going to be for a fairly narrow stretch of time. Mm-hmm. And I think you can work each governor individually to get at those ethers, as opposed to trying to get all three of them above the horizon at a given time.
So you're saying if you're working the ethers that you look at whatever governor, like if they're not all going to be sequentially above, then you look to and call upon that governor or that ether when it's above the horizon.
Yeah, but they're all, like I said, with the exception of two ethers, there is a time during any given day
where all of them are. Okay.
Where all three of the ones attributed to that ether will be above the horizon. Sure.
Okay.
It has to be. It's the nature of the way 12s work and the way division works. Mm-hmm. It's just a fact of astronomical geometry.
Well, let's look a little more. A lot of people work with the ethers, since that's what Crowley did. And fewer people, go in and look at the other things. Now, you say that the elemental or the watchtowers are what a good number of people have worked with. So why don't we spend a little time looking at the watchtowers?
Okay.
Now, you assert that there's a direct relationship between the watchtowers, shown on the golden talisman, and the four watchtower tablets, and also the relationship to the Book of Revelation. Yes,
I assert that. I'm not the only one who asserts it. Tyson makes that pretty blunt assertion too. Mm-hmm. The Golden Dawn, to some degree, tried to distance themselves from that by substituting the Chaldean oracles in places where they had problems with the Book of Revelation. But if you read the diaries, you read A True and Faithful Relation, you will see that there are numerous quotes from the Book of Revelation that are assigned to these places. So I think it's relatively obvious. The most obvious part about it is the kings, who have 6 wings, and there are 6 lines that proceed out of the king's name, and which give you the 6 seniors, and the Enochian system says rather bluntly that the 6 seniors times 4 are the 24 elders or seniors in the Book of Revelation. And so that's central to the system, and everything else sort of revolves around that. It's a really obvious piece of symbolism, and I don't know how else you can take it.
Mm-hmm. Now, doesn't that have implications about the Judaic and the specifically Christian nature of the Enochian systems? Do you think it's a problem if somebody isn't a Christian to work with these?
I don't know, maybe. When I first started working with it, I didn't have any problems with it. But as I moved along, I found myself, I'm buying on some level into a Christian paradigm on one level. Certainly Christian Gnosticism is harmonious with this system, so there's not a problem there. And so is, in fact, the OTO. Thelema, Crowley makes this point somewhere along in one of the secret documents that none of us are supposed to read, that the central secret of OTO is also a Christian secret. So one can come, and what's interesting about this too, you also see Satanists who use this, but they're also working in a Christian paradigm, whether they like to accept that or not. They're working sort of in an inverse Christian paradigm. There's a lot of Christianity in this. I don't know to what degree one has to accept a doctrinal point of view about Christianity. One has to become, say, a Catholic, or Dee was Anglican, I'm Anglican. So it's all harmonious for me. But we have what we call latitudinarian point of view. We accept pretty much, a very wide variety of opinions about what Christianity happens to mean. So, and interpreting Revelation is one of those bugaboos that has, assaulted Christian theologians since the time of, it was written in the early 2nd century, probably. So, each person has to interpret that for themselves, but you're stuck with the fact that, yes, indeed, there is a Christian paradigm going on here. And so you must at least understand it in terms of the Christian paradigm. One's own belief is an entirely different issue.
Okay. Well, let's start looking at a little bit of the watchtower system. Now, where did let's back up and say, where did the actual watchtowers come from? What are they built out of?